Imagine this. The year is 3000 BC. The Nile floods have just receded, leaving behind fertile soil. Farmers rush to sow seeds, scribes scratch records on clay tablets, and priests lift their hands in worship to gods who seem both merciful and terrifying. But behind the grand temples and the towering monuments lies a secret that bound every Egyptian together, from the lowliest worker hauling stone blocks to the pharaoh seated upon his golden throne. That secret was intoxication. Beer, wine, potions, brews so strong they blurred the line between life and death. These weren't just drinks. They were tools of power, medicine, religion, and escape. And in today's journey, we peel back the golden mask of ancient Egypt, not to marvel at the pyramids or mummies, but to uncover just how high these people really got. Before we dive in, where are you watching from right now? Drop your country in the comments. I love seeing how far back in time this channel reaches across the world. If you lived in ancient Egypt, your day almost certainly began and ended with beer. But forget what you think of beer today. This wasn't the crisp lager you buy at a store. Egyptian beer was thick, soupy, more like liquid bread than a refreshing pint. And it was everywhere. Why? Because water wasn't safe. The Nile may have given life, but it was filled with parasites, crocodiles, and diseases. So, Egyptians turned to fermentation. They brewed beer by partially baking bread, crumbling it into vats, and letting the natural yeast bubble into alcohol. The result? A slightly sour, slightly sweet, mildly intoxicating staple. Even children drank it. Even priests drank it. Pharaohs? Of course. Beer wasn't just a drink, it was currency. Workers on the pyramids were often paid in beer rations. One laborer might receive 4 to 5 liters per day, just to keep going under the burning desert sun. Think about that. Entire monuments, the pyramids, the temples of Karnak may have literally been built on a steady buzz of alcohol. And beer wasn't just for the living. Tomb inscriptions reveal that when a loved one passed, offerings of beer were left behind to nourish them in the afterlife. To die without beer was unthinkable. Now, quick question. What time is it where you are right now? It blows my mind how many of you watch these documentaries at midnight, at dawn, or even during lunch breaks. Drop it below. I'm curious how this story fits into your day. If beer was for everyone, wine was for the chosen few. The Egyptians imported it at first, from Canaan and the Levant. Grapes struggled in Egypt's climate, so only the wealthiest could afford it. And unlike beer, wine wasn't gulped down daily. It was reserved for feasts, ceremonies, and offerings to the gods. Hieroglyphic scrolls describe wine cellars filled with jars, each marked with the year, the vineyard, and the name of the winemaker, details that feel shockingly modern. Some of these wines were flavored with herbs, honey, and even tree resins, creating concoctions that were both luxurious and psychoactive. To drink wine in Egypt was to show status. Pharaohs boasted about it. Nobles demanded it at banquets. And in one of history's strangest twists, the Egyptians sometimes dyed their wine red, then drank it as a symbolic substitute for blood, especially during rituals for the goddess Hathor, who was believed to have nearly destroyed humanity in a drunken rage. Yes, you heard that right. In myth, Hathor was tricked into drinking vats of red-dyed beer that she mistook for blood. She became so intoxicated that her wrath subsided, saving mankind. And so, every year, Egyptians celebrated with a festival of drunkenness. But that, my friends, is a story for part 4. Here's the part historians argue about. Did the Egyptians use more than just alcohol? The evidence suggests they did. Traces of blue lotus, a water flower with mild psychoactive properties, have been found in tombs and depicted in art. Priests are shown sniffing its petals, holding cups filled with its extract, and floating it atop bowls of beer. Consumed in large quantities, blue lotus produces euphoria, relaxation, and according to some studies, dreamlike visions. There are also hints of mandrake root, another powerful plant, appearing in ritual art. Mandrake contains compounds that can cause hallucinations, sedation, and even delirium in large doses. In the wrong hands, it's poison. In the right hands, a doorway. And then there's opium. Did the Egyptians have it? Some scholars argue, yes, that they traded for it with their Mediterranean neighbors. Others remain cautious, pointing out that solid archaeological evidence is thin. But considering how widespread opium became in the ancient world, it's hard to imagine Egypt, at the crossroads of trade, was left untouched. Let's step into the sandals of a common Egyptian. You wake up at dawn. You eat bread, onions, maybe some fish if you're lucky. Then you drink beer not to party, but to survive. At midday, you might share more beer with friends, the warm buzz easing the pain of endless labor. At night, festivals light up the streets, with dancers, drummers, and priests pouring out beer and wine in equal measure. For Egyptians, intoxication wasn't just about getting drunk. It was about connecting with each other, with their gods, with the mysteries of life and death. One hymn to Hathor declares, "She who dances in drunkenness, who shakes with intoxication, who laughs with her people." This wasn't shameful. This wasn't sinful. To get drunk was to become closer to the divine. Of course, where there's a drug, there's always someone controlling it. Priests guarded the recipes for special brews. Pharaohs hoarded the strongest wines. Even the act of offering beer to the gods was tightly regulated. Think about it. In a world where everyone drank beer daily, how much control would you have if you controlled the supply? Priests could declare that only they knew the sacred method of preparing a certain intoxicant, turning it into a monopoly of the soul. This wasn't just about faith. It was about power. Skeptical? Let's look at the evidence. Archaeologists have uncovered beer vats the size of small rooms, blackened by millennia of brewing. They've unearthed wine jars, some still sealed, residue clinging to the clay. They've found carvings of the blue lotus, over and over, painted on the walls of tombs. Even chemical analysis has revealed traces of compounds from plants and resin, suggesting that many Egyptian brews were far more complex than we once thought. This wasn't just beer. It was a chemical cocktail. So why did Egyptians get high? Because it tied their world together. Because it made the unbearable bearable. Because it linked their daily grind to their spiritual hopes. Beer filled their stomachs. Wine filled their temples. Herbs and resins filled their rituals. And at every level from slave to pharaoh, Egyptians sought escape, ecstasy, and elevation. Before we wrap part 1, don't forget, if you're enjoying this journey into the shadowy corners of history, hit that subscribe button. Because in part 2, we're leaving the taverns and stepping into the temples, where incense smoke curled through sacred halls, where altered states weren't just common, they were required. And trust me, you've never seen religion like this before. If we left off in part 1, exploring the everyday reality of Egyptian intoxication, beer, bread, and a culture that saw alcohol as both nourishment and divine gift, then part 2 takes us deeper, not just into the taverns and festivals, but into the temple walls, the sacred scrolls, and the mysteries of Egyptian medicine. Because what people often miss is this: the Egyptians weren't just drinking to celebrate. They were experimenting. They were pushing boundaries of consciousness, sometimes deliberately, sometimes dangerously, using plants, brews, and rituals that blur the line between medicine, magic, and getting high. Let's start with something everyone thinks they know about Egypt: wine. When we imagine Egypt, we think of beer as the commoner's drink, and wine is something imported, exotic, and reserved for the rich. That's true, but it's only half the story. Archaeological evidence tells us that Egyptian wine wasn't the smooth, filtered product you'd pour from a bottle today. Their wine was thick, almost syrupy, and often mixed with herbs, resins, or even psychoactive ingredients. Think of it less like a glass of Bordeaux and more like a potion half alcohol, half chemical experiment. The Egyptians were masters of infusion. Residue found in amphorae, wine jars, has revealed traces of mandrake, henbane, and even opium poppy. These weren't flavorings. These were drugs. Mandrake, for example, is hallucinogenic at high doses, producing visions and sometimes delirium. Henbane can create sensations of flight or out-of-body experiences, but it's also highly toxic. And opium, well, that one needs no introduction. The point is, Egyptian elites weren't sipping wine casually at a dinner table. They were altering their minds, exploring states of consciousness that bordered on spiritual ecstasy or terrifying hallucination. But why? Why would priests, nobles, and pharaohs risk this? The answer lies in religion. One of the most misunderstood parts of Egyptian culture is just how central intoxication was to religion. Modern people often assume getting drunk is a private indulgence. For the Egyptians, it was sacred. The most famous example? The Festival of Drunkenness. This was no minor holiday. It was a massive annual event dedicated to the goddess Hathor, deity of love, music, fertility, and importantly, intoxication. The myth behind it goes like this. Once upon a time, the sun god Ra became furious with humanity for rebelling against him. He unleashed his daughter, Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of war and bloodlust, to punish mankind. She went on a rampage, slaughtering humans left and right. Ra realized too late that she wouldn't stop, and that she would wipe out humanity entirely. To trick her, he poured thousands of gallons of red beer across the land, dyed to look like blood. Sekhmet drank it, became intoxicated, and passed out. When she awoke, her rage was gone, and she was transformed into Hathor, the benevolent goddess of joy. Every year, Egyptians reenacted this story. How? By getting absolutely, astronomically drunk. Archaeological records describe mass festivals where both men and women would drink until they collapsed, sometimes vomiting, sometimes passing out in fields around temples. This wasn't shameful, it was holy. To drink until you lost control was to imitate Hathor, to step into her divine narrative. Imagine it. Thousands of people in a temple courtyard, music pounding from drums and sistrums, beer flowing endlessly, women dancing in ecstatic trance. This was intoxication as worship. But here's where it gets darker. Priests sometimes added substances to the festival brews, things that heightened the euphoria, or blurred the line between drunkenness and visions. Some scholars argue that this was intentional, designed to create states where ordinary Egyptians felt closer to the gods. Which raises the question, what exactly were the Egyptians putting in their drinks? To understand this, we have to shift from temples to medical papyri, the ancient texts where Egyptian healers recorded their recipes. And if you thought their rituals were strange, their medicine is even stranger. Take the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents in the world, dating to around 1550 BCE. It's filled with hundreds of prescription herbs, minerals, animal parts, all combined into remedies for everything from toothaches to infertility. But many of these recipes don't read like medicine. They read like mind-altering experiments. One remedy, for example, prescribes mandrake root steeped in wine to relieve pain and induce sleep. But mandrake doesn't just sedate. It can cause hallucinations, delirium, even sensations of flying. Another mentions lotus flowers, specifically the blue lotus, Nymphaea caerulea, which modern researchers have confirmed contains compounds with mild psychoactive properties, creating relaxation, dreamlike states, and even mild euphoria. The blue lotus, in fact, appears everywhere in Egyptian art on tomb walls, in the hands of gods, tucked into banquet scenes, where nobles lounge with cups of wine. Was this just decoration? Or was it a subtle nod that their gatherings were more elevated than we imagine? Many historians believe the lotus was a psychoactive symbol, representing altered consciousness, divine visions, and sexual potency. And then there's the big one, opium. Did the Egyptians know opium? The debate is fierce. Some scholars argue that the opium poppy didn't reach Egypt until later periods, imported from the Near East. Others point to traces of opium alkaloids found in hair samples from mummies, suggesting its presence far earlier. If true, this would mean Egyptians had access to one of the most powerful narcotics in history millennia before modern medicine even understood it. Imagine mixing opium into a wine infusion, drinking it at a temple ritual, and slipping into visions so vivid that you swore you saw Hathor dancing before you. Whether or not opium was common, one thing is certain: the Egyptians were experimenting with altered states. They didn't separate medicine from magic, intoxication from ritual. To them, healing the body often required healing the spirit, and that sometimes meant shifting consciousness entirely. So far, we've talked about the masses, the festivals, the healers, the everyday rituals. But what about the rulers? Were the pharaohs themselves experimenting with altered states? The answer seems to be yes. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were seen as living gods, intermediaries between the divine and mortal worlds. To fulfill this role, they often underwent intense rituals of purification, fasting, and yes, intoxication. Some temple inscriptions describe pharaohs drinking the wine of Ara, a sacred beverage mixed with herbs that granted them visions of the gods. Others mention lotus wine, which again suggests the infusion of psychoactive plants. These weren't recreational cocktails. They were tools of statecraft, ways for rulers to claim divine visions and authority. If a pharaoh said, "I drank the wine of Re and spoke to the gods," who would dare question it? This may even explain the presence of unusual grave goods in tombs. In Tutankhamun's burial, for instance, archaeologists found large jars of wine, some still sealed, their contents intact after thousands of years. Testing has revealed traces of resins and herbs in these wines, suggesting they weren't meant for drinking at a feast. They were meant for something else, perhaps a journey in the afterlife that required more than just food. Perhaps it required a mind-altering journey of its own. It's easy to romanticize all this visions, divine intoxication, sacred festivals, but there's a darker side we can't ignore. Addiction. Even in antiquity, Egyptians seem to have struggled with the dangers of overindulgence. Scribes wrote moral instructions, warning young men not to spend their days in taverns, not to drink until they collapsed, not to waste their energy chasing intoxication. These weren't abstract lessons. They were real, practical warnings. In a society where beer was safer than water, where festivals encouraged excess, where healers prescribed psychoactive infusions, addiction was inevitable. And then there's toxicity. Many of the plants Egyptians experimented with, mandrake, henbane, even certain lotuses, are highly dangerous at the wrong dose. Without precise measurements, what was meant to be a trance could easily become a death sentence. Some scholars even argue that unexplained deaths of nobles and royals may have been accidental overdoses. The irony? The very substances that Egyptians believed brought them closer to the gods could also drag them closer to death. By now, you can see the pattern. The Egyptians weren't just a civilization of pyramids and mummies. They were chemists, ritualists, and frankly psychonauts, people exploring altered states long before modern science. But here's the real twist. Egypt wasn't alone. When we step beyond the Nile, into Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond, we find other ancient cultures experimenting with equally bizarre and dangerous highs. Which brings us to Part 3, how the Egyptian obsession with intoxication connected to the wider ancient world, how their rituals influenced Greek mystery cults, Roman festivals, and maybe even the origins of Western religion itself. And if you thought Egypt was strange, wait until you see what other civilizations were doing. When we left off in Part 2, we saw how the Egyptians used beer, wine, blue lotus, mandrake, and maybe even opium. not just for pleasure, but as sacred tools of medicine, ritual, and visions. But here's where things get even more fascinating. Egypt wasn't operating in isolation. Ancient cultures traded, borrowed, and influenced each other far more than most people realize. And when it came to altered states, the Nile Valley's experiments rippled outward across the Mediterranean world. This raises a big question. Did Egypt inspire other civilizations to pursue their own sacred highs? The evidence suggests yes. If you've heard of Greek religion, you've probably heard of Zeus, Athena, and Apollo. But the real beating heart of Greek spirituality wasn't just the Olympian gods. It was the mystery cult-secret religious societies that promised initiates not only blessings in this life, but revelations of the afterlife itself. The most famous of these was the Eleusinian Mysteries, held near Athens for nearly 2,000 years. Thousands of people, peasants, nobles, even Roman emperors traveled to the sanctuary of Demeter and Persephone to undergo an initiation so profound that participants were forbidden to ever reveal its secrets. What happened inside the Telesterion, the Great Hall of Initiation, remains one of history's most closely guarded mysteries. But here's the thing. Ancient writers dropped hints. They describe a sacred drink called kykeon, consumed during the ritual. On the surface, it was just barley mixed with water and mint. But scholars today suspect something far stronger was going on. Why? Because the initiates consistently described visions of death, rebirth, and divine revelation. Some accounts even suggest they saw Persephone herself, the goddess who journeys between life and death. These weren't just metaphors. They sound like the reports of people who had ingested a powerful hallucinogen. One theory is that the barley used in kykeon was infected with ergot, a fungus containing lysergic acid compounds, the same family of chemicals that would one day lead to LSD. In small doses, ergot can induce intense visions, out-of-body experiences, and feelings of cosmic unity. In large doses, it's deadly. Sound familiar? That razor's edge between enlightenment and poisoning was exactly what Egyptians faced with mandrake or henbane. Now here's the link. Egypt had long traded with Greece, especially during the Mycenaean period and later. Greek travelers, priests, and scholars visited Egyptian temples, studied their rites, and brought home stories. Could the Eleusinian Mysteries have been inspired, at least in part, by Egyptian festivals of intoxication, like the Festival of Drunkenness? Some historians believe so. The idea of consuming a sacred drink to achieve union with the divine feels strikingly similar. If Greece borrowed the idea of sacred intoxication, Rome took it and dialed it up to chaos. The Romans worshipped Bacchus, or Dionysus, from Greek tradition, the god of wine, ecstasy, and freedom from restraint. His festivals, the Bacchanalia, were notorious. Picture this. Men and women gathering at night in hidden groves, drinking themselves into oblivion, dancing wildly, chanting, sometimes stripping naked, sometimes engaging in frenzied sexual rites. To the Roman Senate, this wasn't religion, it was anarchy. In 186 BCE, the Senate cracked down, issuing the famous Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, banning most Bacchic rites across Italy. The official reason? Fear that these drunken rituals were destabilizing society, encouraging rebellion, and corrupting morals. But notice the theme again. Intoxication wasn't just tolerated, it was spiritualized. To get drunk, to lose yourself, to enter ecstasy that was seen as communion with a god. The same divine intoxication Egypt had celebrated under Hathor now reappeared in Rome under Bacchus. And just like Egypt, the Romans weren't afraid to spike their drinks. Ancient texts describe Roman wines being mixed with myrrh, frankincense, and even psychoactive herbs imported from the East. To drink Roman wine wasn't just to drink, it was to consume a chemical cocktail. Where did the Romans learn this habit of infusing wine with strange substances? Many trace it back to Egyptian influence during the Ptolemaic period, when Greek and Egyptian cultures fused under rulers like Cleopatra. Alexandria became the hub of experimentation, not just in science, but in altered states. Not all cultures embrace this so openly. In fact, one of the most striking contrasts comes from the Hebrew Bible, written in the same general region and time frame as late Egyptian civilization. The Bible is filled with warnings against drunkenness, stories of Noah collapsing naked after wine, or Lot being deceived by his daughters while drunk. Priests were explicitly forbidden from drinking before entering the temple. The implication is clear. While Egypt and its neighbors used intoxication as a bridge to the divine, Israelite religion sought to separate holiness from altered states. Why? Possibly as a reaction. If Egyptian priests claimed visions through wine and lotus, Israelite prophets wanted to distinguish themselves by saying, "Our God speaks through clarity, not drunkenness." It was a cultural line in the sand, but even here, traces remain. The Song of Songs, one of the most mystical books of the Bible, compares love to intoxication. And prophets like Ezekiel describe visions so strange, wheels within wheels, creatures with multiple faces, that some scholars have wondered if altered states played a role. So what ties all this together? Egypt, Greece, Rome, even biblical traditions. The idea that ecstasy was proof. To the ancients, visions weren't delusions. They were validation. If you drank the sacred brew, danced in the festival, or inhaled the incense and saw gods, then the gods were real. Your vision wasn't questioned. It was celebrated. Think about how different this is from our modern mindset. Today, if someone said, "I drank a potion and saw a goddess," we'd probably call it hallucination. In antiquity, that was evidence of divine encounter. Egypt crystallized this mindset. Their festivals, their temple drinks, their lotus rituals, they created a framework where intoxication equaled revelation. And once that framework spread, it took root everywhere. But there's also a dark thread running through this story. Danger. In Greece, ergot poisoning sometimes killed initiates. In Rome, Bacchanalia descended into riots, leading to mass arrests and executions. In Israel, prophets denounced drunken visions as false. And in Egypt itself, the very same substances that lifted people into trance states sometimes killed them outright. Addiction was real, overdoses were real, and not every vision was divine. That duality, the sacred high and the deadly low, haunted every ancient civilization that flirted with intoxication. Even as their influence spread, Egypt kept evolving its own traditions. Later dynasties leaned heavily into syncretism, mixing Egyptian gods with Greek and Roman ones. Hathor became linked to Aphrodite, Osiris to Dionysus. The rituals of intoxication blurred together, creating hybrid festivals where Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans all worshipped under the same haze of alcohol and smoke. And yet, Egypt never lost its unique stamp. The Blue Lotus remained theirs. The Festival of Drunkenness remained a distinctly Egyptian holiday, tied to their own myths of Sekhmet and Hathor. When we look at the wider Mediterranean, Egypt wasn't just one intoxicated culture among many. It was the origin point, the spark that lit the flame. And this brings us to a turning point. Because while the ancient world embraced intoxication as divine, the medieval world took a very different path. Christianity swept across Europe, Islam across the Middle East, both with far stricter attitudes toward alcohol and drugs. What happened to the ancient tradition of sacred highs? Was it lost forever, buried with Egypt's temples and Greece's mystery cults? Not exactly. In Part 4, we'll uncover how fragments of this ancient practice survived, hidden in monasteries, alchemical texts, and folk medicine, and how the echoes of Egypt's experiments with intoxication still shape the Middle Ages. When we last left off, Egypt's intoxicating rituals had spread into Greece, Rome, and beyond, shaping how entire civilizations understood the divine. But then came a seismic shift. The old gods fell. New religions rose. Christianity in the West, Islam in the East. At first glance, this looked like the end of the ancient tradition of sacred intoxication. Christianity denounced drunkenness as sinful. Islam outright prohibited wine. The gods of ecstasy were replaced by faiths of discipline, morality, and law. So you'd expect the ancient ways to vanish, right? They didn't. Instead, they went underground. Christianity condemned drunken revelry, but paradoxically, it kept wine at the very center of its most sacred ritual, the Eucharist. Think about it. Every Sunday, believers gather to drink wine that symbolizes, and in many traditions, literally becomes, the blood of Christ. The act is communal, transformative, and mystical. Sound familiar? It's a direct echo of the old mystery cults, where sacred drinks open the path to the divine. The Church never admitted this debt. Instead, it reframed it. No longer was the wine meant to induce visions or ecstasy. Instead, the miracle was hidden in symbolism. The power was spiritual, not chemical. But to the average worshiper, the ritual of drinking divine wine carried the same weight as it had for their ancestors under Hathor, Dionysus, or Osiris. And here's the twist. Not all Christian sects kept the wine ordinary. Medieval records suggest that certain fringe groups, Gnostic sects, heretical cults experimented with spiking the Eucharistic wine with psychoactive herbs. These secret rites were often condemned as sorcery. But the fact they existed at all shows that people were still chasing altered states through the very heart of Christianity. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks became the guardians of medicinal knowledge. Copying ancient texts, they preserved fragments of Egyptian, Greek, and Roman pharmacology. Take mandrake, for instance. This hallucinogenic root, so dangerous in high doses, was carefully cataloged by monastic scribes. In medieval Europe, it was used as a sedative, an anesthetic for surgery, and just as in Egypt, as a magical talisman. Or henbane, a plant that could both heal and intoxicate. Monks knew of its properties. In some monasteries, it was used to brew medicinal beers for pain relief. Even the blue lotus of Egypt makes mysterious appearances in later herbals. Though its supply in Europe was limited, knowledge of its sedative and euphoric effects trickled through trade routes and texts. What does this mean? The monasteries weren't just libraries. They were laboratories. The substances once used in Egyptian temples survived, disguised as medicine. While Christianity wrestled with its double standard, the Islamic world went in a different direction. The Quran forbade wine, and Islamic law strongly discouraged intoxication. Yet at the same time, Islamic scholars became some of the greatest experimenters in the history of chemistry. Their field? Alchemy. Alchemy wasn't just about turning lead into gold. It was about transformation of metals, of the soul, of consciousness. And in their pursuit of transformation, Muslim scholars experimented with distillation, extraction, and purification of substances. It was in the Islamic world that distilled alcohol was first perfected not for drinking, but for medicine and perfume. Alchemists like Jabir ibn Hayyan described processes that turned crude mixtures into powerful essences. The knowledge of how to concentrate substances, whether for healing or intoxication, was preserved and advanced under Islam. At the same time, Sufi mystics sought union with God through practices that sometimes bordered on intoxication. Whirling dances, rhythmic chanting, and the burning of incense. For them, ecstasy wasn't chemical, but it echoed the same quest the Egyptians once pursued. A state beyond the self, where human and divine meet. But the clearest heirs of Egypt's intoxicating heritage weren't in monasteries or mosques. They were in the villages. Throughout medieval Europe, folk healers, often women, kept alive the knowledge of psychoactive plants. Mandrake, henbane, belladonna, and datura became the ingredients of witches' brews. These weren't fairy tales. They were real ointments and potions that could induce hallucinations, paralysis, and flights of the imagination. One infamous concoction was the flying ointment, said to allow witches to soar through the night sky. Modern analysis suggests these ointments contained tropane alkaloids from plants like belladonna and henbane chemicals that cause vivid hallucinations of flying. Sound far-fetched? To medieval peasants, the visions were real. Just as Egyptians once saw gods in their lotus dreams, villagers in Europe saw themselves riding through the night with spirits. And here's the link. Many of these recipes trace back, in part, to ancient pharmacology. Egyptian, Greek, and Roman texts had described these plants centuries earlier. The knowledge had trickled down, warped, and merged with folk beliefs. Of course, the medieval church saw these practices as dangerous. Anything involving potions, visions, or altered states was branded witchcraft. The irony? The same church still used wine in mass, incense in cathedrals, and sedatives in monastic medicine. But when villagers used similar substances outside official channels, it became heresy. The witch hunts of the late Middle Ages and Renaissance weren't just about heresy. They were about control, about stamping out rival traditions of altered states that threatened the church as monopoly on spiritual experience. And yet, despite centuries of persecution, the knowledge survived. The folk healers, the wise women, the heretics, they carried the torch of the ancients. So let's zoom out. What do we see? In Christianity, sacred wine preserved the ritual of divine intoxication. In Islam, alchemists advanced the science of substances, even while condemning drunkenness. In folk traditions, witches' brews and ointments kept alive the hallucinogenic heritage of plants. Everywhere we look, we find echoes of Egypt. The festival of drunkenness may have ended, the temples may have fallen, but the idea that altered states could connect humans to something beyond themselves never died. It simply adapted. By the late Middle Ages, Europe stood on the brink of a new age, the Renaissance. Classical texts, many preserved by Islamic scholars, flowed back into Europe. Suddenly, the lost knowledge of Egypt, Greece, and Rome was rediscovered. Alchemy exploded in popularity. Herbal medicine was codified in new books. Explorers brought back exotic plants from the New World: tobacco, coca, peyote, adding even more to the ancient arsenal. It was as if the old tradition of sacred intoxication, buried for 1,000 years, was reborn. But this rebirth came with new questions. Could these substances be studied scientifically? Could they be controlled, standardized, harnessed, not for gods, but for human advancement? That question would shape the modern era. And that's where we're headed next. In Part 5, we'll enter the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration, when Europe rediscovered the intoxicating secrets of Egypt and added whole new worlds of substances into the mix. We'll see how this set the stage for modern chemistry, medicine, and yes, even the drugs we know today. When the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance, Europe began to wake from centuries of intellectual slumber. Artists painted with new realism, scholars rediscovered lost texts, and explorers set sail across oceans to map out an entire globe. But there was something else flowing beneath the surface of this rebirth, the resurrection of ancient knowledge about intoxicants. Ideas that had been buried with the mummies of Egypt, locked away in Greek manuscripts, or whispered only in cloisters and alchemical workshops, began to resurface. And just like in the Nile Valley thousands of years before, these substances were never merely recreational. They were linked to medicine, visions, commerce, power, and control. The Renaissance did not just rediscover beauty, it rediscovered ways to alter reality itself. The spark of this revival began in libraries. During the 14th and 15th centuries, scholars in Italy and beyond began digging into manuscripts preserved in monasteries or smuggled from the collapsing Byzantine Empire. Works of Galen, Dioscorides, and Avicenna were translated into Latin and circulated widely. Among them were detailed pharmacological texts describing opium, mandrake, cannabis, henbane, and other mind-altering plants. Dioscorides de Materia Medica, originally compiled in the 1st century CE, became a standard medical reference for nearly 1,500 years. It cataloged not only the uses of herbs, but also their narcotic and psychoactive effects. To Renaissance physicians, this was not superstition. It was science rediscovered. Opium returned to operating tables, now distilled into syrups to dull surgical agony. Cannabis and hemp were discussed as remedies for melancholy, inflammation, and though they didn't phrase it that way, stress. But the real magic lay not just in treating pain, but in the possibility of bending the human experience. If the ancients had used these plants to commune with gods, could Renaissance minds use them to glimpse truths beyond ordinary perception? While scholars rediscovered texts, alchemists worked in smoky laboratories, seeking the ultimate transformation. Most were after the philosopher's stone, the legendary substance that could turn base metals into gold and grant immortality. But along the way, they discovered something else, the art of distillation. Distillation, which had roots in ancient Egypt and the Islamic world, allowed alchemists to extract the essence of plants. Instead of chewing a root or boiling leaves into tea, one could now pull out a concentrated liquid, a tincture or spirit, far stronger than the raw material. Alcohol itself became both medicine and intoxicant on a new scale. By the 15th century, brandy and distilled wine were common in apothecaries. They were called aqua vita, the water of life. Physicians prescribed it for everything from digestive troubles to melancholy. Of course, patients soon learned that it could also make one forget grief entirely, at least for a few hours. Other distillations focused on opium. Paracelsus, the 16th century Swiss physician, alchemist, and radical thinker, developed a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol. He named it laudanum. In his words, it was the most precious gift of God to humankind. It dulled pain, soothed coughs, and knocked patients into blissful sleep. But like the lotus of the Nile, it also carried dependency. By the 17th century, laudanum was spreading across Europe as both miracle cure and subtle curse. At the same time, darker currents swirled. The Renaissance coincided with one of Europe's most brutal chapters, the witch hunts. And woven into those accusations were plants long associated with altered states, the very same ones Egyptians had catalogued as gateways to visions. Witches were said to brew ointments of henbane, belladonna, mandrake, and datura, nightshades rich in hallucinogenic alkaloids. The famous flying ointments supposedly let them ride through the night sky. Modern pharmacology suggests these salves, absorbed through the skin, could indeed induce vivid hallucinations of flying, transformation, or communion with spirits. What terrified inquisitors was not that these women were imagining things, but that the experiences felt real. Just as in ancient temple rituals, substances blurred the line between vision and reality. To church authorities, that was indistinguishable from demonic possession. So the same plants once placed in pharaohs' tombs or inscribed in Egyptian medical papyri now became evidence of heresy. What was divine in Thebes became diabolical in Cologne or Toulouse. But Europe's rediscovery of intoxicants was not limited to ancient texts. The age of exploration brought contact with entirely new substances that would transform global culture. When Columbus stumbled into the Caribbean, he encountered tobacco. Indigenous peoples of the Americas had used it in ritual, medicine, and social bonding for centuries. Rolled, smoked, or snuffed, tobacco brought a head rush and a sense of communion with spirits. By the mid-16th century, it was flooding into Europe. Physicians praised it as a cure-all, even as sailors and nobles became addicted. The Spanish conquest of the Andes introduced coca, the sacred leaf of the Inca, chewed to banish fatigue and hunger. Though Europeans were slow to adopt chewing coca directly, they marveled at its effects and carried stories of its powers back to Europe. Centuries later, this fascination would culminate in the isolation of cocaine. In Mesoamerica, the Aztecs offered another revelation: cacao mixed with chili and spices. It was stimulating, nourishing, and mood-altering. Though not intoxicating in the same way as opium, chocolate became a daily ritual for Europe's elite, changing diets and economies forever. The world was being rewired by plants, some that dulled pain, some that awakened visions, and some that simply energized daily life. The Egyptians had once traded incense and lotus across the Mediterranean. Now, galleons carried barrels of tobacco, sacks of cacao, and crates of coca across oceans, binding continents in networks of intoxication. It is impossible to separate these substances from the rise of empire. Tobacco plantations in the Americas fueled the Atlantic slave trade, with millions of Africans forced into labor to produce Europe's new obsession. The addictive pleasures of smoke were built on unimaginable suffering. Likewise, opium, laudanum, and alcohol would later become tools of empire, traded and taxed, used to pacify populations, and weaponized in geopolitics. The seeds of those conflicts were planted during the Renaissance, when intoxicants moved from local rituals into global markets. For the Egyptians, substances had been sacred, tied to gods and afterlife. For Renaissance Europe, they became commodities. Yet the same paradox persisted. The very plants that opened minds and healed bodies could also enslave and destroy. One of the most striking features of this era was how knowledge itself was guarded. Apothecaries and physicians had access to texts and recipes that common people could never see. The Latin language acted as a barrier. Only the educated elite could read the full descriptions of opium dosages or the dangerous properties of mandrake. This secrecy echoed ancient priesthoods, where only initiated scribes or temple healers knew the recipes for sacred oils and elixirs. Knowledge of intoxication had always been power, and in both Egypt and Renaissance Europe, that power was jealously guarded. But the printing press began to crack that monopoly. Suddenly, books of remedies and herbals could be copied and distributed widely. Illustrations of cannabis, opium poppies, and nightshade plants circulated in works like the Herbarium Vivae Acones. The gatekeepers were losing control. Ordinary people began experimenting with their own gardens and brews. The democratization of intoxication had begun. By the 17th century, Europe was awash with substances both ancient and new. Opium tinctures flowed from apothecaries. Tobacco smoke filled taverns and city streets. Chocolate, coffee, and tea fueled intellectual debates in cafes. And whispered rumors of witches' salves and secret societies hinted at hidden currents of altered consciousness. If you walked into a European city in 1650, you might have smelled the acrid smoke of tobacco, the bitter aroma of coffee, and the perfumed wafts of incense burning in cathedrals. Each of those scents carried a history stretching back through Egypt, Greece, and beyond. The Renaissance had not invented intoxication. It had rediscovered it, reinvented it, and globalized it. But beneath the glittering art and scientific breakthroughs, the same questions haunted humanity that had once haunted the banks of the Nile. Where does medicine end and poison begin? Is intoxication a gift of the gods or a temptation of demons? And if altering consciousness can bring both wisdom and destruction, who has the right to control it? The answers were no clearer in Florence than they had been in Thebes. But one thing was certain: the world was more intoxicated than ever. And as we turn to the Enlightenment and the modern era, those ancient highs would evolve again into revolutions, epidemics, and the foundations of modern science. The Renaissance had reopened the door to ancient knowledge, blending herbs, rituals, and imported plants into daily life. But as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, Europe was entering a new phase, the Enlightenment. It was an era of reason, science, and experimentation, or so it claimed. Beneath the surface of rational philosophy and scientific progress, something more primal was unfolding: a new relationship with intoxicants. For the first time in history, Drugs were no longer just divine gifts, folk remedies, or whispered secrets. They were being dissected, cataloged, refined, and crucially, marketed. The Egyptians had used plants to touch gods. The Enlightenment used them to probe the human body itself. And in doing so, it set the stage for a new age of narcotics, one that would transform medicine, society, and global politics forever. By the dawn of the 18th century, Europe was addicted to a new set of stimulants. Coffee, tea, and chocolate had transformed from exotic luxuries into staples of urban life. In London, Paris, and Vienna, coffee houses became the nerve centers of intellectual life. Inside these smoky, bustling rooms, men debated politics, science, and philosophy over steaming cups of coffee. Voltaire reportedly drank over 50 cups a day. Isaac Newton, Samuel Johnson, and countless others found their minds sharpened and their conversations fueled by caffeine. To contemporaries, this was more than habit. It was progress in liquid form. Coffee houses were nicknamed penny universities because for the price of a cup, one could hear the latest scientific theories, political gossip, or literary critiques. But stimulants were not without controversy. Coffee was accused of causing sterility, madness, and even rebellion. Tea was taxed heavily, sparking protests that culminated in the Boston Tea Party. And chocolate, often mixed with sugar, was blamed for gluttony and moral decay. Still, none of this slowed their spread. Unlike opium or cannabis, these stimulants were embraced by states and empires because they fueled productivity. They made workers more alert, intellectuals more creative, and soldiers more resilient. Unlike the trance-inducing blue lotus of Egypt, caffeine kept people awake and working. That made it the perfect drug for an age obsessed with progress. At the same time, a quiet revolution was unfolding in laboratories. For centuries, healers had relied on whole plants, opium sap, cannabis resin, mandrake root. But now, scientists were beginning to isolate their active ingredients. This process began tentatively in the 17th century, but by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, breakthroughs changed everything. Chemists extracted morphine from opium, isolating the alkaloid that carried its power. Later, they pulled cocaine from coca leaves, quinine from cinchona bark, and caffeine itself from coffee beans. This was more than academic curiosity. It meant, for the first time, drugs could be standardized, dosed precisely, and prescribed scientifically. A doctor could give you not just some opium, but exactly measured milligrams of morphine. It also meant that drugs could be far stronger than anything known to the ancients. Egyptian priests had brewed narcotic beers and pressed lotus petals, but morphine was an entirely different beast. Concentrated, potent, and addictive in ways even the poppy fields of Thebes could not have imagined. The Enlightenment prided itself on rationality, yet its relationship with intoxicants was riddled with contradiction. On one hand, stimulants like coffee and tea were praised as sober, civilizing forces that sharpened the mind. On the other, narcotics like opium were both revered as medical miracles and feared as corrupting vices. Alcohol remained ubiquitous, fueling both celebration and misery. Gin epidemics in 18th century London saw entire neighborhoods consumed by cheap spirits, leading to moral panics and public health crises. Governments taxed intoxicants heavily, recognizing their profitability. Philosophers debated their morality. Doctors prescribed them liberally. And ordinary people, from dock workers to duchesses, consumed them daily. It was an age that declared reason supreme, but one that quietly relied on stimulants, narcotics, and alcohol to grease the gears of progress. As Europe expanded its global reach, intoxicants became inseparable from empire. Tea fueled the British East India Company, which controlled trade routes from China to India. Sugar, used to sweeten chocolate and tea, drove the expansion of Caribbean plantations and the enslavement of millions of Africans. Tobacco spread from Virginia plantations across Europe, sparking fortunes and health crises alike. Opium, still primarily grown in Asia, was becoming a central player in global trade networks. It would soon erupt into open conflict. Every sip of tea in a London parlor, every puff of tobacco in a Paris cafe, every pinch of snuff in a Viennese ballroom, all were connected to ships, colonies, slaves, and empires. Intoxication had gone global, and it was powered by exploitation. Among all these substances, opium stood apart. For physicians, it was indispensable. It dulled pain during surgery, soothed coughs, calmed diarrhea, and quieted the minds of the sleepless. But it was also intoxicating. Writers and thinkers began to experiment with opium, not just for health, but for creativity. In the 18th century, opium became a muse. Poets like Thomas de Quincey and Samuel Taylor Coleridge wrote of its dreamlike visions, describing landscapes of terror and beauty that seemed to come from another world. Their writings romanticized opium as a gateway to artistic genius, even as addiction hollowed out their lives. To many in the Enlightenment, opium embodied the paradox of intoxication. Was it medicine or madness, inspiration or ruin? The Egyptians had buried it with their dead as a sacred offering. The Enlightenment sold it in pharmacies, taxed it in ports, and scribbled poems under its influence. The spread of intoxicants also sparked some of the first modern debates about public health. As gin ravaged London's poor, critics like William Hogarth depicted mothers dropping babies while drunk and men drinking themselves into oblivion. Pamphlets warned of moral collapse. Legislators passed gin acts to regulate and tax spirits, though often with limited effect. At the same time, physicians warned about the dangers of tobacco, noting its effects on lungs and heart. Critics attacked coffeehouses as dens of sedition, or radicals plotted revolutions. Even tea, so associated with refinement, became a flashpoint in colonial resistance when taxes pushed American colonists into open rebellion. In every case, intoxicants were never just personal choices. They were political, moral, and economic battlegrounds. The Enlightenment might have promised reason and rationality, but in practice, entire societies were shaped and sometimes destabilized by what people smoked, drank, and swallowed. By the close of the 18th century, the world was on the brink of industrialization. Machines were transforming labor. Empires were stretching across continents. Revolutions were brewing in America and France. And beneath all of it, intoxicants pulsed like a hidden current. Coffee fueled debate in revolutionary Paris. Rum paid for slaves in the triangular trade. Opium tinctures filled the cabinets of European households. Tobacco smoke clouded drawing rooms and taverns alike. For thousands of years, from the blue lotus of the Nile to the gin lanes of London, humans had sought ways to alter consciousness. But now, with science refining ancient substances into pure chemicals, and empires turning plants into global commodities, the stakes were higher than ever. The Egyptians had once asked, could intoxication bring you closer to the divine? The Enlightenment asked a different question. Could it be measured, sold, and controlled? The answer would shape the modern world. And as the 19th century dawned, the intoxicants of the ancients were about to explode into narcotics of unprecedented power, fueling wars, epidemics, and revolutions. The dawn of the 19th century brought with it a transformation unlike anything the world had seen before. Factories rose, cities swelled, and machines thundered. Industrialization promised progress, faster work, greater wealth, and a future powered by iron and steam. But hidden within this revolution was another, quieter force, the mass production of intoxicants. For centuries, plants like the poppy, coca, and cannabis had been grown in fields, harvested by hand, and prepared in traditional ways. Now, with new technologies and scientific breakthroughs, these ancient substances were being refined, concentrated, and distributed on an industrial scale. The results were staggering. Substances that had once been sacred offerings or folk remedies became global commodities. They crossed oceans, fueled economies, and left millions addicted. And in one of history's darkest ironies, they sparked wars fought not over territory or ideology, but over who controlled the world's supply of drugs. In 1803, a young German pharmacist named Friedrich Serdener made a discovery that would change medicine and addiction forever. From raw opium, he isolated a pure alkaloid and named it morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Unlike crude opium, which varied in strength, morphine could be precisely measured. Doctors hailed it as a miracle drug, a powerful painkiller, an effective sedative, and a tool for surgeries that once seemed unbearable. Then came another invention, the hypodermic syringe, developed in the 1850s. For the first time, morphine could be injected directly into the bloodstream. The effects were near instantaneous: relief, euphoria, and all too often, dependence. Morphine was celebrated as the soldier's drug during the American Civil War, where it was used to treat battlefield wounds. But countless veterans returned home with what was called the soldier's disease: addiction. The Egyptians had chewed opium pods as part of sacred rites. Now, thanks to science and industry, their ancient poppy had become a refined chemical that hooked millions. While morphine spread through Europe and America, another ancient plant was entering the modern age. For thousands of years, indigenous peoples in the Andes had chewed coca leaves, using the mild stimulant to ease hunger, fatigue, and altitude sickness. In the 1850s, scientists isolated the active compound, cocaine, and much like morphine, its purified form was exponentially stronger than the raw plant. By the late 19th century, cocaine was everywhere. It was hailed as a wonder drug, capable of treating everything from depression to toothaches. Sigmund Freud praised it as a cure for melancholy and addiction. Surgeons used it as a local anesthetic, and entrepreneurs marketed it in tonics and beverages, most famously Coca-Cola, which originally contained real coca extracts. The effects were exhilarating, but devastating. Cocaine provided bursts of energy and euphoria, but left users restless, paranoid, and craving more. Unlike coca chewing in the Andes, which was moderate and embedded in culture, industrial cocaine use spread without limits. Alcohol, too, was transformed by the Industrial Revolution. Distillation methods improved, production scaled, and urban centers saw an explosion of taverns, saloons, and gin palaces. Gin, once blamed for the moral decay of 18th century London, returned in spectacular fashion. Cheap, strong, and widely available, it became the drink of choice for the working poor. Taverns became escape valves for factory laborers, offering temporary relief from grueling shifts and cramped tenements. For the middle and upper classes, new cocktails, wines, and spirits became fashionable markers of sophistication. Champagne was linked to celebration. Whiskey was tied to frontier ruggedness. Rum remained the sailor's staple. But beneath the glitter and glamour was a growing crisis of alcoholism. For governments and churches, this fueled temperance movements that would eventually reshape societies, from Britain's Gin Acts to America's push for prohibition. No substance, however, had greater global impact in the 19th century than opium. In China, opium use had spread from medicine to recreation. By the 18th century, millions were smoking it daily, often mixed with tobacco in long pipes. The Chinese state tried to ban it, but the demand was insatiable. European traders saw opportunity. The British East India Company cultivated vast opium fields in India, shipping tons of the drug to China in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. The trade was staggeringly profitable, but it destabilized Chinese society, draining silver reserves and creating widespread addiction. The Qing dynasty fought back, confiscating opium shipments and punishing dealers. Britain responded with force. Between 1839 and 1842, and again Between 1856 and 1860, Britain and China clashed in what became known as the Opium Wars. On the surface, these were trade disputes. In reality, they were wars fought to force open China's markets and ensure the continued flow of opium. British warships, armed with modern weapons, easily defeated Chinese forces. The result was a series of humiliating treaties that opened Chinese ports to foreign powers, ceded Hong Kong to Britain, and legalized the opium trade. The human cost was devastating. Addiction spread across China, hollowing out communities and weakening the state. What had once been a sacred plant in ancient Egypt was now the cause of international conflict, death, and humiliation. By the mid-19th century, addiction was no longer confined to poets or fringe communities. It was a mass phenomenon. Morphine addiction plagued veterans and patients. Cocaine use spread through medical circles and consumer products. Alcoholism ravaged cities, fueling crime and poverty. Opium devastated entire nations, particularly China. For the first time, governments, doctors, and societies began grappling with addiction as a public health crisis. The very substances that had been hailed as miracles, gifts of progress, science, and empire, revealed their darker side. What tied all of this together was industrialization. Machines mass-produced intoxicants faster than ever. Ships carried them across oceans. Empires taxed and profited from them. And science purified them into powerful forms. The human body, once touched gently by the lotus, coca leaf, or wine, was now flooded with industrial-strength chemicals. Progress had unlocked new possibilities, but also new dangers. Where the Egyptians had sought ecstasy and divine connection, the industrial age delivered efficiency, addiction, and empire. Intoxication was no longer just a ritual or medicine. It was a business, a weapon, and a global force. As the 19th century drew to a close, the world stood on the brink of modernity. Electricity lit streets, trains connected continents, and empires stretched to every corner of the globe. And behind it all, intoxicants lingered. In every gin palace, opium den, morphine syringe, and bottle of tonic laced with cocaine. They had fueled wars, shaped economies, and rewritten medicine. But the story was far from over. For in the 20th century, intoxicants would become even more entangled with politics, crime, rebellion, and culture. The age of industry had given the world modern drugs. The next age would wrestle with how to control them. The 20th century is often painted as an age of progress medicine, technology, democracy, industry. But beneath the shiny surface of innovation lay an obsession as old as time: intoxication. The same impulses that drove ancient Egyptians to chew blue lotus petals or sip fermented beer resurfaced in an age of cars, radios, and world wars. Humans were still chasing altered states, but now governments, corporations, and underground networks were fighting to control the highs. This is the century where the relationship between humans and intoxicants turned into a battlefield, sometimes literal, sometimes cultural, always political. And strangely enough, much of it still mirrors the ancient truth. Substances were never just about pleasure. They were about control, survival, rebellion, and power. At the dawn of the 20th century, America and parts of Europe were already deep in the throes of what would become the temperance movement. For decades, religious groups, social reformers, and middle-class activists had been warning about the evils of drink. Alcohol was blamed for domestic violence, poverty, crime, and the decline of morality. To them, beer wasn't simply a beverage. It was a societal toxin tearing families apart. In 1920, the United States passed the 18th Amendment, ushering in the infamous Prohibition era. Alcohol was outlawed, distilleries and breweries were shuttered, and the government believed they had finally tamed humanity's thirst for intoxication. But here's the irony: rather than suppressing the urge, Prohibition supercharged it. People didn't stop drinking. They just changed where and how they drank. Speakeasies, the hidden underground bars, exploded across the country. Bootleggers smuggled liquor across borders, sometimes lacing it with dangerous chemicals that killed thousands. Organized crime flourished as gangs like Al Capone's built empires on the back of illegal booze. What was happening wasn't new. Ancient Egypt also had its moralists. In temple inscriptions and papyrus scrolls, scribes warned against drunkenness. Pharaohs issued decrees regulating beer rations to workers, not out of concern for health, but for control. Just like prohibition, it wasn't about eliminating intoxication. It was about deciding who got to enjoy it and who didn't. While alcohol became the center of cultural wars, another battle was brewing worldwide, this time over drugs far more potent. For centuries, opium had been a fixture in Asia, traded along the Silk Road and consumed by emperors, soldiers, and farmers alike. But by the early 1900s, Western governments began to see it differently. Opium dens in port cities like London, San Francisco, and Shanghai became demonized as dens of depravity, associated with crime and racial fears. By 1912, the Hague Opium Convention became the first international treaty to restrict narcotics. Soon after, morphine and cocaine were swept into the crackdown. These weren't fringe drugs, they were everywhere. Cocaine was in soda fountains, cough syrups, and even toothache drops for children. Morphine was handed out to soldiers in World War I like candy, earning it the grim nickname, the soldier's disease, because so many came home addicted. The bans didn't stop usage. They just drove it underground. Street dealers replaced pharmacists. Criminal networks replaced corporations. And just like with prohibition, people sought new ways to get the same highs. The Egyptians would have understood this perfectly. Thousands of years earlier, their society also regulated intoxicants. Blue lotus was allowed in temple rituals, but frowned upon in casual excess. Beer rations were controlled to maintain workforce productivity. In both cases, the desire for altered states never died. It simply shifted in form when authority tried to suppress it. By mid-century, the world was in a paradox. On one hand, governments were banning and criminalizing substances with new urgency. On the other, the human demand for intoxication had never been higher. This demand created black markets that transformed into vast underground economies. In New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, drug lords and mobsters turned banned substances into fortunes. In Europe, heroin and amphetamines flowed through post-war black markets, often supplied by corrupt officials and desperate chemists. What's striking here is how the narrative of drugs began to split. On one side, governments painted narcotics as diseases of the poor, demonizing addicts as morally weak or criminally inclined. On the other side, the wealthy elite continued to indulge just in private. Celebrities, politicians, and businessmen all had access to what the law said was forbidden. In ancient Egypt, the divide was just as stark. Common laborers had their beer diluted, carefully rationed, while the elite feasted on stronger brews and rare imported wines. Blue lotus petals were depicted in the hands of pharaohs and nobles on tomb walls, not peasants. Across time, the story was the same. Intoxication was never eliminated, only stratified. If there was ever proof that intoxicants are inseparable from human survival, it was World War II. Every major army weaponized drugs. German soldiers were issued Pervitin, a methamphetamine pill, to keep them awake during endless marches and tank battles. Blitzkrieg wasn't just strategy, it was chemically fueled. Historians argue that without meth, the lightning-fast invasions of France and Poland might not have been possible. Allied troops, too, had their stimulants. American and British forces distributed Benzedrine, an amphetamine, to pilots and infantry. In the Pacific, Japanese kamikaze pilots often flew their final missions under the influence of amphetamines to suppress fear. Even civilians weren't untouched. Rationing shortages and wartime stress made alcohol, tobacco, and morphine essential morale boosters on the home front. The use of drugs in war wasn't a modern invention, it was just modernized. Ancient Egyptian armies carried beer into battle, not just for calories, but to numb pain and fear. Soldiers in temple reliefs are shown drinking before combat rituals. Across millennia, the battlefield was never free of chemical assistance. By the 1960s, the world shifted again. For centuries, intoxicants were associated with survival, control, or vice. But suddenly, they became tied to something new: rebellion. LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, and marijuana exploded in popularity among young people. Unlike alcohol or opium, these weren't just escapes. They were framed as tools for enlightenment. Writers, musicians, and philosophers embraced psychedelics as gateways to higher consciousness, spiritual awakening, and political revolution. The Beatles sang about altered states in songs that millions hummed worldwide. Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist, urged Americans to turn on, tune in, drop out. Protesters against the Vietnam War saw marijuana and LSD as not just substances, but symbols of resistance against authority. Governments panicked. To them, this wasn't just about drugs, it was about order. Laws tightened, raids increased, and propaganda campaigns warned of reefer madness and psychedelic psychosis. But no crackdown could erase the cultural shift. Intoxication wasn't merely about numbing pain anymore. It had become a political weapon. And again, history seemed to repeat itself. In Egypt, Blue Lotus wasn't just a recreational high. It was sacred, tied to religious rituals, and possibly even visions of the afterlife. Psychedelics of the 1960s played a similar role. Substances not only to escape reality, but to transcend it. As the 20th century closed, humanity had built skyscrapers, split the atom, and walked on the moon. Yet when it came to intoxicants, we were still walking the same cycle as the ancients. Governments outlawed substances, only to drive them underground. Elites indulged while the poor were punished. War turned drugs into weapons, and rebels turned them into symbols of freedom. The lesson was clear. Intoxication isn't a glitch in civilization. It is civilization. It shapes economies, politics, art, and war. Just as Egyptian priests brewed wine for rituals, just as workers drank beer to endure the sun, modern humans found their own versions of Blue Lotus and barley brew. But this isn't the end of the story. The stage was now set for the late 20th and early 21st centuries, where a new war would erupt, the infamous war on drugs. Billions would be spent, millions imprisoned, and yet the ancient hunger for altered states would not only survive, but thrive in new, unexpected forms. By the late 20th century, humanity had reached a new kind of crossroads. The desire for intoxication was stronger than ever, but governments around the world believed they had found the solution: total war. Not against nations, not against armies, but against substances. This was the birth of what history now calls the war on drugs. It was one of the most ambitious and controversial campaigns in modern history. Billions of dollars were spent, millions of lives were upended, and entire societies were reshaped. Yet beneath the propaganda and the politics, the same story from ancient Egypt still pulsed through the centuries. Humans have never been able to live without their highs. In June 1971, U.S. President Richard Nixon stood before the nation and uttered the phrase that would change everything: America's public enemy #1 is drug abuse. With those words, Nixon declared an all-out war on drugs. But this wasn't just about health or addiction. Recently declassified documents reveal a darker motive. Nixon's administration saw drug prohibition as a way to target two groups they viewed as political enemies: anti-war protesters and black communities. By criminalizing marijuana and heroin, they could disrupt those groups, raid their homes, arrest their leaders, and weaken their movements, all under the guise of law and order. What started as a domestic policy quickly became a global crusade. America pressured allies to follow suit, tying foreign aid to strict anti-drug laws. Soon, countries from Colombia to Thailand were reshaping their societies to align with U.S. drug war policies. It was empire building through prohibition, echoing the way ancient Egyptian rulers used control of intoxicants, beer rations, temple wines, lotus petals as tools of social and political dominance. If the 1970s were the start of the war, the 1980s were the explosion. Cocaine became the drug of choice for a generation chasing glamour, wealth, and power. From Wall Street bankers to Hollywood stars, powdered cocaine was a status symbol, a high that promised confidence, charisma, and energy. But beneath the glitz lay carnage. In Colombia, cartels like Medellin, led by Pablo Escobar and Cali, grew into criminal empires worth billions. They waged wars against each other and the state, leaving tens of thousands dead. Entire neighborhoods became battlegrounds, and governments struggled to contain the violence. Meanwhile, in the United States, the cheaper, smokable form of cocaine crack flooded poor communities. The response was swift and brutal. Harsh sentencing laws, mandatory minimums, and police militarization. The hypocrisy was staggering. Wealthy users of powdered cocaine often escaped with fines or probation. Poor Black and Latino users of crack were sent to prison for decades. Once again, intoxicants revealed an ancient truth. The line between acceptable and criminal was never about the substance. It was about who was using it. Ancient Egypt saw the same dynamics. Blue lotus petals were revered in the hands of the wealthy, while drunkenness among laborers was condemned as disorderly. The cycle repeated, dressed in modern clothes. While America battled cocaine, Asia was fueling a different high, heroin. The Golden Triangle, the mountainous border region of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand, became the world's largest supplier. Local warlords and militias profited from the trade, using opium money to fund private armies and local economies. Entire villages became dependent on the crop, with little alternative for survival. At the same time, Afghanistan emerged as another opium powerhouse. After the Soviet invasion in 1979, the U.S. funneled money and weapons to Afghan warlords fighting the Soviets. Many of those same warlords financed their militias through opium production. Ironically, while the U.S. fought a drug war at home, it was indirectly funding the drug trade abroad. This paradox mirrors ancient Egypt's economic use of intoxicants. Beer was not just a drink, it was a form of currency, a staple wage for workers, and a vital part of the economy. Just as ancient workers survived off daily beer rations, modern farmers in Myanmar and Afghanistan survived off poppy crops. In both cases, intoxicants weren't luxuries, they were lifelines. If heroin and cocaine dominated the late 20th century, methamphetamine became the drug of the early 21st. Unlike cocaine or heroin, meth didn't require tropical plants or vast fields. It could be cooked in makeshift labs with chemicals from hardware stores and pharmacies. This made it both terrifyingly accessible and nearly impossible to eradicate. From rural America to Southeast Asia, meth spread like wildfire. Governments launched raids, burned labs, and passed harsher laws, but demand never slowed. In fact, meth became the drug of the working poor truck drivers, factory workers, and laborers who needed energy to push through long shifts. The ancient echoes are clear here too. Egyptians gave their workers beer, not just as payment, but as fuel liquid calories to keep building pyramids and temples under the brutal sun. Meth was a modern version of the same impulse, a tool for survival disguised as a high. By the 1990s and 2000s, the war on drugs had become more than policy, it was a military campaign. In Colombia, US-backed Plan Colombia poured billions into spraying herbicides over coca fields, training paramilitary forces, and funding counter-narcotics armies. The result? Massive displacement of rural farmers, environmental devastation, and yet coca production barely declined. In Mexico, cartels grew so powerful that entire cities became war zones. Decapitated bodies hung from bridges. Mass graves filled the countryside, and tens of thousands disappeared. The cartels, like ancient Egyptian priesthoods, became alternative power structures, challenging the state itself. In Southeast Asia, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte launched a bloody war on drugs that left thousands executed without trial, echoing ancient practices where intoxication could mean not just exile, but death. The story remained unchanged. Governments tried to crush the human hunger for intoxication, but instead created chaos, violence, and black markets stronger than ever. And then, something unexpected happened. As the drug war raged, cracks began to appear in the narrative. By the 1990s, patients with cancer, AIDS, and chronic pain began advocating for the medical use of marijuana. What had been demonized for decades was now reframed as medicine. In 1996, California became the first U.S. state to legalize medical marijuana. Others followed. By the 2010s, entire countries like Canada and Uruguay legalized recreational cannabis outright. Billion-dollar industries emerged, and politicians who once condemned marijuana now courted it as a tax revenue goldmine. The irony? Ancient Egypt had long seen intoxicants as both dangerous and divine. Beer could be a sacred offering to the gods or a destructive force in excess. Blue lotus could be a ritual tool or a personal indulgence. Once again, the line between poison and medicine depended on context and power. While marijuana gained legitimacy, another crisis erupted: the opioid epidemic. Pharmaceutical companies in the 1990s and 2000s aggressively marketed synthetic opioids like OxyContin as safe, non-addictive painkillers. Doctors prescribed them by the millions, often under pressure from corporate sales reps. But the truth was devastating. These drugs were highly addictive, and entire communities, especially in rural America, were consumed by dependency. When prescriptions tightened, users turned to heroin and fentanyl, far deadlier alternatives. Overdose deaths skyrocketed. By the 2020s, the opioid crisis had claimed hundreds of thousands of lives in the U.S. alone. This was nothing new in human history. Ancient Egyptians knew their intoxicants could heal or harm. Medical papyri list plants and concoctions with warnings about dosage and misuse. Too much blue lotus, too much fermented beer, and the line between remedy and ruin disappeared. The modern opioid crisis is just a technological upgrade of the same ancient dilemma. By the dawn of the 21st century, the war on drugs had cost trillions, incarcerated millions, and devastated communities. And yet, intoxicants were more available than ever. From marijuana dispensaries in Los Angeles to meth labs in Myanmar, from fentanyl pills in Ohio to coca fields in Colombia, the truth was unavoidable. It doesn't matter if the pharaoh controls the beer, if the president declares war, or if cartels battle armies in the streets. The hunger is older than nations, older than religions, older than civilization itself. The war on drugs revealed a paradox that Egypt had known thousands of years earlier. Intoxication isn't the exception, it's the rule. Attempts to eliminate it only change its form, never its existence. The story doesn't end here, because in the 21st century, something extraordinary is happening. Scientists are rediscovering the very substances once demonized psychedelics, cannabis, even MDMA, and reframing them not as threats, but as tools of healing. The 21st century began with the ashes of a global drug war. Nations had spent billions trying to stamp out human intoxication, and yet the highs never stopped. Cocaine fields burned, but new crops grew. Meth labs were destroyed, but new ones rose. Opioids destroyed communities, yet prescriptions continued. But in the middle of this chaos, something extraordinary happened. A quiet revolution began not in the streets, not in the cartels, not in the black markets, but in the laboratories, universities, and clinics of the modern world. Substances once condemned as dangerous poisons suddenly re-emerged as possible medicines, tools for healing minds and spirits. This was the psychedelic Renaissance. And in many ways, it brought humanity full circle, back to the sacred flowers, roots, and brews of the ancient Egyptians. By the early 2000s, researchers who had long been restricted by prohibition finally began to push back. Studies on psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy, and ayahuasca, a South American psychedelic brew, revealed something astonishing. When used carefully, these substances could help treat depression, PTSD, anxiety, and addiction. Patients described experiences of deep connection, ego dissolution, and spiritual clarity, echoing the same language ancient priests used when describing Blue Lotus rituals. Along the Nile, one participant in a psilocybin study described it like this: "It was like dying and being reborn, but in a way that healed me instead of breaking me." Compare that to the ancient Egyptian funerary texts, where the journey of the soul required symbolic death, transcendence, and rebirth into the afterlife. The parallels are uncanny. Perhaps the most dramatic rediscovery has been MDMA, once vilified as a party drug. MDMA is now being tested as a breakthrough treatment for PTSD. Veterans, survivors of abuse, and victims of violence reported remarkable results. Under medical supervision, the drug allowed them to revisit traumatic memories without being overwhelmed, to process pain without drowning in it. By the late 2010s, clinical trials showed such success that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration granted MDMA-assisted therapy breakthrough status. If approved, it could become a prescription treatment, changing millions of lives. Ancient Egyptians would not be surprised. They, too, used intoxicants as bridges between pain and healing. Whether through beer in ritual feasts, blue lotus in sacred ceremonies, or opium for physical suffering, they knew that altering consciousness could be a path to restoration. Meanwhile, ayahuasca, an Amazonian brew made of the Banisteriopsis caapi vine and the chacruna leaf spread, from jungle ceremonies to urban retreat centers. Western seekers traveled to Peru, Brazil, and Colombia to sit with shamans, drinking the bitter liquid and undergoing nights of visions, purging, and transformation. The visions were often terrifying, yet profoundly healing. People described meeting spirits, reliving childhood traumas, or experiencing communion with the universe itself. This was not far removed from what Egyptian priests described in temple rituals. The blue lotus was often depicted as opening pathways to the divine, allowing worshippers to commune with gods and ancestors. Ayahuasca users and ancient Egyptians were separated by oceans and millennia, yet they sought the same thing: transcendence. Psilocybin research has taken the world by storm. Patients with terminal cancer reported reduced fear of death after a single psychedelic session. People with depression resistant to years of medication found relief after carefully guided mushroom ceremonies. At the heart of these experiences was the ego death, a temporary dissolving of the boundaries between self and world. Patients often reported feeling at one with everything, as if they were no longer separate from life itself. This concept echoes ancient Egyptian cosmology. In their mythology, the god Osiris was dismembered and resurrected, symbolizing both literal death and symbolic transformation. To lose the self, to die, and be reborn was the path to immortality. Psilocybin brought that ancient truth back into the modern clinic. Another surprising player in the psychedelic renaissance is ketamine. Originally developed as a battlefield anesthetic, ketamine gained notoriety as a club drug. But in the 2010s, doctors began using it in small, controlled doses to treat severe depression. For patients who had lost all hope, ketamine therapy provided rapid, sometimes life-saving relief. In just hours, suicidal thoughts could lift. Clinics offering ketamine infusions multiplied across the globe, a strange blend of ancient ritual and modern science. Ancient Egyptians would recognize the pattern. Their use of intoxicants was often double-edged, sacred and dangerous, healing and intoxicating. Ketamine carries the same duality. In one context, a life-saving medicine; in another, a dangerous escape. No plant symbolizes the cyclical nature of intoxicants more than cannabis. Demonized in the 20th century, cannabis has now returned as a global industry worth tens of billions of dollars. Medical cannabis treats chronic pain, epilepsy, and multiple sclerosis. Recreational cannabis is legal in Canada, Uruguay, and many U.S. states. The same plant once associated with crime and shame is now a luxury product sold in sleek dispensaries. Ancient Egypt knew this cycle well. Cannabis pollen has been found in Egyptian mummies, and some medical texts suggest its use for inflammation and pain. Like the blue lotus, cannabis lived in both worlds: medicine and pleasure, ritual and recreation. Here's the extraordinary thing. Modern psychedelic therapy sessions look eerily similar to ancient Egyptian rituals. Set and setting. Just as Egyptian priests carefully prepared temples with incense, chants, and sacred symbols, modern therapists emphasize the environment: comfortable rooms, music, guidance. Guides and healers. Egyptian priests led initiates through altered states. Today, trained therapists guide patients through psychedelic journeys. Intention and meaning. Egyptians sought communion with gods, healing, and transformation. Modern patients seek relief from trauma, meaning in suffering, or a glimpse beyond death. The technology has changed, but the essence has not. Humans still turn to altered states to confront fear, to heal wounds, and to seek transcendence. So, what comes next? The psychedelic renaissance suggests a new chapter in humanity's eternal relationship with intoxication. Instead of demonizing or blindly indulging, perhaps society is learning to balance, to use these substances with reverence, caution, and wisdom. Clinical trials with psilocybin may soon make it a prescription treatment. MDMA-assisted therapy could transform how we treat trauma. Cannabis continues to shift from taboo to mainstream. Digital technology may even create new intoxicants, virtual reality trips, neurostimulation, or designer molecules crafted for specific emotional states. But one truth will remain. Whether in the shadows of the pyramids, the jungles of the Amazon, the clinics of New York, or the labs of London, humans will always seek ways to alter their minds. It is not a weakness, it is a defining feature of who we are. Looking back across 5,000 years, from the beer of ancient Egypt to the psychedelics of today, a pattern emerges. 1. Discovery. A new substance enters human life, offering pleasure, healing, or transcendence. 2. Adoption. Societies embrace it, weaving it into ritual, medicine, or economy. 3. Control. Authorities step in, regulating who may use it and when. 4. Prohibition. Fear, abuse, or politics lead to bans and stigmatization. 5. Rebirth. Eventually, the cycle turns again, and the substance is rediscovered, often as medicine. Beer, blue lotus, cannabis, opium, cocaine, psilocybin. The cycle never ends. When we look at a patient in a modern clinic, lying back with eyes covered, guided by music, whispering about visions of unity, we are not witnessing something new. We are witnessing something as old as civilization itself. The ancient Egyptians floated in the perfume of blue lotus, believing they touched the divine. Today, a cancer patient under psilocybin believes they have glimpsed eternity. The tools are different, but the hunger is the same. The eternal truth is this: humans are intoxicated beings. We do not merely survive. We seek to transcend. From Nile temples to neon cities, from forbidden powders to medical prescriptions, our story has always been written in the language of altered states.